On the morning of the 23rd of June, in the year 1757, in a mango grove near a village called Plassey, in the green and rain-soaked country of Bengal, two armies stood facing each other across a field that would decide the fate of a subcontinent. And the strange thing, the thing almost nobody tells you about that morning, is that one of those armies had already lost before a single shot was fired. Not because it was smaller, it was not smaller, it was enormous. Picture it for a moment the way you might picture a great, slow river of men spreading across the horizon. Around 50,000 soldiers belonging to the Nawab of Bengal, a young ruler named Siraj-ud-Dowlah, with cavalry and infantry and elephants and field guns, a force so vast it seemed to fill the whole plain. And against them on the other side, a thin line of perhaps 3,000 men under a British commander named Robert Clive. 3,000 against 50,000. If you knew nothing else, you would already know how that story should end. But it did not end that way. And the reason it did not end that way is the quiet, almost unbelievable heart of everything we are going to talk about tonight. Because Robert Clive did not really win that battle with his 3,000 men. He won it with money. He won it before the morning even came, in secret rooms with whispered promises and written guarantees, by reaching across the field and buying the loyalty of the enemy's own general. His name was Mir Jafar. He was the commander of the Nawab's army, the man trusted to lead those tens of thousands of soldiers into the fight. And Mir Jafar had already been bought. He had already agreed in private that when the moment came, he would simply hold his troops back. He would stand still. He would let the battle be lost. In exchange, he was promised the throne of Bengal itself, made into a puppet, a ruler in name who would answer to the men who had paid for him. So when the two armies met in that grove, the largest part of the Nawab's force never truly moved. The fighting that day was brief. A monsoon shower came down across the field, and the British, who had thought to cover their gunpowder with tarpaulins, kept their powder dry, while the Nawab's guns, soaked and useless, fell silent. And by the end of it, a young Nawab fled, and an empire of millions began, quietly, without anyone quite deciding it should, to change hands. This is the story of how that happened, the entire story. And it is one of the strangest stories in all of human history, because the thing that won at Plassey, the thing that came to rule 60 million people, the thing that built an army of 250,000 men, twice the size of Britain's own standing army, was not a king. It was not a nation. It was not even really a government. It was a company, a business, a joint stock corporation owned by shareholders, governed by men in a building on a street in London, who met to vote on dividends and argue about profits and worry about the price of their stock. And somehow, almost by accident, and almost entirely in pursuit of money, that company became one of the most powerful states the world has ever seen. So settle in, get comfortable, pull the blanket up to your chin and let your shoulders drop, because we are going to take this slowly, the way these things are best taken, like a long walk down a familiar road in the dark, with no need to hurry and nowhere we have to be. I'm going to tell you the whole thing from the very beginning, from a cold December day in the year 1600, all the way through to the strange and hollow end of it, more than 2.5 centuries later. There will be spices and silver, textiles and tea, bribes and battles, and a famine and a rebellion. There will be a wooden tiger that plays music. There will be opium, and a company so large it had to be rescued by its own government before the modern world had even invented a phrase for what it was. And through all of it, like a single thread you can follow with your eyes half closed, there runs one simple, quiet truth. Follow the money. Every step this company took, every territory it swallowed, every war it fought, came from a balance sheet, from a debt, from a dividend, from a shareholder somewhere wanting a return. The men taking each step thought each step small and reasonable and necessary, and the sum of all those small reasonable steps was something monstrous. Before we go any further, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Tell me in the comments. Whether you are somewhere bright and warm or somewhere deep in the cold and the dark like the London where this story begins, I genuinely like to know who is out there in the quiet with me. And if you are new here and you find that the slow unwinding of a strange true story helps carry you towards sleep, then this is the kind of thing this channel makes. Welcome to Late Night Explainer. Stay a while. There is no rush at all. Now, let us go back. Let us go all the way back to the very end of the year 1600, to a London you would barely recognize, a city of timber and smoke and narrow lanes, where Queen Elizabeth I sat on the throne of England, an aging woman near the end of a long reign, ruler of a small, damp, ambitious island on the edge of Europe that was, at that moment, very much not the center of the world. England was a minor power. The real money, the real glamour, the real spice and silk and gold, all of that flowed through other hands. The Portuguese had been first to sail around Africa and into the eastern seas. The Spanish had their vast silver empire in the Americas. And the Dutch, those tireless, clever, waterbound merchants across the narrow sea, were beginning to build a trading network that would soon dominate the globe. England, by comparison, was a latecomer standing at the edge of the party, looking in. But England had merchants, and those merchants had heard the stories, and they had seen the prices. They had seen what a single shipload of pepper or nutmeg could be worth when it came home from the far side of the world. These were spices that grew only in a handful of tiny islands thousands of miles away, and by the time they reached a London table, having passed through the hands of Arab traders and Venetian middlemen and Portuguese fleets, each one taking their cut, the price had climbed to something extraordinary. A sack of pepper could be worth a small fortune. Nutmeg, that humble little brown seed you might grate over a warm drink on a winter night, was at times worth, ounce for ounce, more than gold. And the men of London looked at those prices, and they had a very simple, very human thought. What if we cut out the middlemen? What if we sailed there ourselves, all the way to the source, and brought the spices home in our own ships? The profit, if it worked, would be almost beyond imagining. But there was a problem, and it was a serious one. A voyage like that was enormously expensive and almost unbearably dangerous. You needed great ships and crews to sail them, and guns to defend them, and money, mountains of money, to buy goods to trade and to provision a journey that might last 2 or 3 years. And after all of that, the ship might simply never come back. It might sink in a storm off the African coast. It might be taken by the Dutch or the Portuguese. The crew might die of disease. The whole investment, everything you had put in, could vanish beneath the waves, and you would have nothing. No single merchant, however rich, wanted to risk his entire fortune on one roll of the dice like that. And so they did something rather clever, something that in its way is one of the quiet inventions that shaped the modern world. Rather than one man risking everything, a group of men came together and each put in a share. They pooled their money, 218 investors, merchants and aldermen and men of means, each subscribing what they could afford to lose, so that if a ship went down, no one of them was ruined. They spread the risk across many shoulders, and in return they would all share in the profit, in proportion to what they had put in. This is the joint stock idea, the seed of the modern company, the great-grandfather of every corporation whose name you know today. And on the very last day of the year 1600, the 31st of December, these merchants received from Queen Elizabeth a royal charter, a piece of paper signed and sealed by the Crown that gave them official, exclusive permission to do what they wanted to do. The name on that charter is a mouthful, and it is worth saying slowly because it tells you exactly what they thought they were and what they meant to do. They were the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies. Not an empire, not an army. Merchants of London trading. That was the whole of the ambition written right there in the name. And the charter gave them something precious. It gave them a monopoly lasting 15 years on all English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope, that great southern tip of Africa around which any ship had to sail to reach the eastern seas. For 15 years, no other English merchant could legally trade in those waters. The whole of the East, as far as England was concerned, was theirs. Think about how small and how strange that beginning was. A few hundred men pooling their coins in a London hall, given a slip of royal parchment, setting out to trade in spices on the far side of the planet. There is no army here. There is no plan to conquer anything. There are no 60 million subjects. There is just a wish to buy low in the islands and sell high at home, and to come back alive. If you had told any one of those 218 investors that the thing they were founding would one day rule a subcontinent, field an army twice the size of their nations, and have to be rescued from bankruptcy by Parliament itself, they would have looked at you as if you were mad. They wanted pepper, that was all. They wanted pepper and nutmeg and a good return on their money. And so the first ships sailed, and here is the first thing that almost nobody expects, because we call this the East India Company, and we think immediately of India, of the great forts and the marching sepoys and all that came later. But India was not where they were going. Not at first. The first voyages of this company were not aimed at India at all. They were aimed much further east to a scattering of tiny tropical islands in the Indonesian archipelago, the Moluccas, sometimes called the Maluku Islands, the fabled Spice Islands themselves, because that was where the treasure grew. That was where the pepper came from, and the cloves and the mace, and above all the nutmeg, those few small specks of land in a warm green sea that were, at that moment, among the most valuable real estate on earth, because the most precious flavors in the world grew there and nowhere else. So picture those first English ships, small wooden vessels by our standards, crowded and creaking and smelling of tar and salt and unwashed men, setting out from the cold grey Thames and sailing south for month after month, down past Africa, around that fearsome Cape of Good Hope, where the two great oceans meet and the storms can swallow a ship whole, then on across the wide and lonely Indian Ocean toward the islands of the East. It was a voyage to the very edge of the known world. Many men who sailed did not return, and those who did return came home, if they were lucky, with holds full of spice and a profit that could make a man rich for life. But there was a shadow over this whole bright dream, and the shadow was Dutch, because while the English were making their first careful, hopeful voyages, the merchants of the Netherlands were doing the very same thing, only faster and harder, and with far more money and far more ruthlessness behind them. In the year 1602, just 2 years after the English received their charter, the Dutch founded their own great trading company, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the United East India Company, known to history simply as the VOC. And the VOC was a monster. It was larger, richer, and more aggressive than its English rival in almost every way. The Dutch did not merely want to trade in the Spice Islands, they wanted to own them. They wanted total control, a stranglehold over the nutmeg and the cloves so complete that they alone would set the price for the entire world. And they were willing to do appalling things to get it. So in those eastern seas, the English and the Dutch became rivals, circling each other around the same handful of precious islands, and the English, being smaller and weaker and later to arrive, kept finding themselves outmatched. The Dutch had more ships in those waters, they had more guns, they had more soldiers and forts, and the will to use them. Again and again the English merchants found themselves pushed aside squeezed out, denied the best of the trade by Dutch power that they simply could not match. It was a frustrating, dangerous, often humiliating struggle, and for a while it looked as though the whole eastern venture of the London Company might come to nothing, choked off by a stronger neighbour in the very islands they had crossed the world to reach. And then came the event that more than any other turned the English away from the spices and set them, almost by accident, on the long road to India. It happened in the year 1623 on the island of Amboyna, one of those small Moluccan islands the two companies were fighting over. The details are murky, as such things often are, but the essence of it is this. The Dutch authorities on the island accused a group of Englishmen of plotting against them. The men were arrested. They were interrogated, and the interrogation, by the accounts that came down to us, involved torture. And in the end, 10 Englishmen were executed, put to death on a far-off island by the agents of the rival company. The Amboyna massacre, as the English came to call it, sent a shock of outrage all the way back to London. It became a byword for Dutch cruelty and treachery, a wound that the English nursed for generations. But beyond the anger, it carried a hard and practical lesson. The lesson was simple. The Dutch were too strong in the Spice Islands. The English could not win there. To keep fighting for the nutmeg and the cloves of the Moluccas was to keep losing men and ships and money in a contest they were not going to win. And so, slowly, almost reluctantly, the English merchants began to lift their eyes away from those small eastern islands and to look westward toward a different, vaster shore, toward the great subcontinent that lay between them and the Spice Islands, toward India. And this is one of those quiet hinges on which the whole of history turns, the kind of moment you could almost miss if you were not watching for it. The East India Company did not march purposefully into India out of grand ambition. It backed into India sideways because it had been beaten out of somewhere else. It went to India for spices and found something it had not been looking for at all. It found cloth. It found the cotton textiles of the Indian subcontinent, the calicos and the muslins and the printed chintzes, fabrics so fine and so beautiful and so cheap by European standards that they would become an obsession across the whole of Europe and reshape the company's entire reason for being. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, and there is no need to hurry. That is a thread we will pick up gently in a little while. For now, simply hold the shape of this beginning in your mind as you drift. A small island nation, latecomer to the riches of the world. A few hundred merchants pooling their money against the terror of a sinking ship. A slip of parchment from an aging queen on the last day of the year 1600, granting them 15 years of monopoly and a name that promised nothing more than trade. Ships sailing south into the unknown after pepper and nutmeg. A stronger rival, the Dutch and their VOC, beating them back from the islands they crossed the world to reach. And a massacre on a distant shore that turned them, almost against their will, toward the land that would one day make them masters of millions. None of these men knew that is the thing to hold on to as your eyes grow heavy. Not one of them, not the investors counting their shares in a London hall, not the captains setting their course around the Cape, not even the Queen who signed the charter, had the faintest idea what they were setting in motion. They thought they were starting a business, a risky, hopeful little business, trading in flavors from the far side of the world. They could not have imagined the army of 250,000 men. They could not have imagined the bribe at Plassey or the throne of Bengal changing hands in a rain-soaked grove. They could not have imagined the famine or the opium or the tea thrown into a harbour on the far side of yet another ocean, or the rebellion, or the long, hollow end of it all. They were merchants of London, trading into the East Indies, and from that small, ordinary, money-minded beginning, an empire was going to grow slowly and quietly, one reasonable step at a time, each step small to the men who took it, the whole of it almost beyond belief. So let that picture settle over you now, soft and dim, like lamplight in an old window. The cold of that December in 1600, the creak of wooden ships, the smell of pepper and tar and the sea, the whole vast story still folded up inside it, waiting like a seed in the dark. And as we go on, as we follow the company across the water to the shores of India, into the great Mughal court, into the forts and the warehouses heavy with cloth, the road will lead us, step by quiet step, toward that mango grove at Plassey where we began, and the bribe that bought an empire and everything that came after. There is a long way still to walk, but there is no need to stay awake for all of it. The story will keep. And so for now, we simply drift on gently toward the next turn in the road. Begin at the grove, then, before we go back to the beginning. Picture it the way it really was, not the way the storybooks painted it later. The 23rd of June, 1757. Monsoon weather, the sky low and bruised, the air thick enough to drink. On one side, the army of Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the young Nawab of Bengal, near 50,000 men with cannon and cavalry and elephants spread across the field in numbers that should have settled the matter in an afternoon. And on the other side, Robert Clive with roughly 3,000. Do the arithmetic in the dark behind your eyes, 50,000 against 3,000. By every rule of war that has ever been written, the small force should have been swept away like leaves before a flood. And yet it was not. Because the battle had already been lost before it began, and not on the field. It had been lost in quiet rooms, in whispered conversations, in promises of money passed from hand to hand. Clive had reached the Nawab's own commander, a man named Mir Jafar, and bought him. Bought his loyalty, bought his silence, bought the great mass of soldiers he was meant to lead. When the moment came, Mir Jafar held his troops back. The largest part of that 50,000 simply stood and watched, doing nothing, waiting for the outcome that had already been agreed upon in advance. The fighting that actually happened was brief, almost incidental. The rain came down and soaked the Nawab's gunpowder, while the company kept its own dry under tarpaulins, and the cannon that should have torn the small force apart fell silent in the wet. It was less a battle than a performance, a thing arranged beforehand, with the appearance of a fight laid over the top of a transaction. That is the true shape of it, and it is stranger and quieter than any heroic charge. An empire of 60 million people did not turn on courage or on steel. It turned on a bribe. The throne of Bengal changed hands in a rain-soaked grove because one man had been paid to lose. Hold that in your mind as you sink down towards sleep, because everything that follows in this long story runs on the same hidden machinery. Not glory, money, always underneath the money. And here is the thing that should keep pulling at you, gently, the way a current pulls at a swimmer who has stopped fighting it. This was a company, not a kingdom, not a crown, not a nation marching out under its banners. A company. A business owned by shareholders, men who had bought a stake in it the way you might buy a stake in any venture, hoping for a return on their investment. Those shareholders met in a building on a street in London, far from any battlefield, far from the heat and the rain and the dying. They voted. They argued over dividends. They worried about the price of their stock. And by some slow accretion that none of them had ever planned, the decisions made in that London room came to govern the lives of 60 million people on the far side of the world, and to command an army that would one day swell to 250,000 men, larger than the standing army of Britain itself. How does that happen? How does a trading firm end up as a tax-collecting, war-waging sovereign over a subcontinent? That is the question we are going to walk into, slowly, together, over the long hours ahead. Before we go further, let me ask you something. The way I always do, tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight. Whatever the hour is, wherever you are, whatever the weather outside your window, leave a word below if you feel like it. I find it a quiet comfort knowing this old story is being heard in so many different places at once. And if you are new here, if you have only just found your way to this slow corner of the dark, you might think about subscribing so the next long story finds you the next time you cannot sleep. There, that is done. Now we can let the modern world fall away entirely and go back, all the way back, to the cold and the candlelight where this began. So return with me to that last day of the year 1600, the 31st of December, the very edge of one century tipping over into the next. In London, on that day, Queen Elizabeth I put her name to a royal charter, and with it she breathed into existence a thing with one of the longest and most cumbersome names ever given to a company. The Governor and Company of Merchants of London, trading into the East Indies. Say it slowly to yourself the way you might count something to fall asleep. The Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies. It sounds like exactly what it was meant to be. Dry, careful, legal, a name with no menace in it at all. There is no army in that name, no empire, no famine, no opium, no harbour full of dumped tea, just merchants and London and the long road east. What the charter granted was a monopoly. For 15 years, no other English subject could lawfully trade east of the Cape of Good Hope, that great rounded shoulder of southern Africa where the two oceans meet without the company's leave. 15 years of exclusive right handed to a small group of men who had pooled their money and their nerve. 218 of them, that first body of investors. 218 names on a list, putting their coin into a hopeful, dangerous venture with no idea whether the ships they paid for would ever come home. And the early voyages were funded one at a time, each its own separate gamble, money raised for a single journey and then settled up when, or if, that journey returned. It would be many decades yet, not until the time of Cromwell, before it hardened into a permanent joint stock company, the kind where the capital stays in place and the venture simply continues year upon year. At the start, it was looser than that. Hopeful, improvised, a handful of merchants betting on the wind. And here is the part that the later story almost forgets entirely. They were not at the beginning even looking at India. India was not the prize. India was barely the thought. What those first ships sailed for was spice. The Spice Islands, far out in the great scattered archipelago of what we now call Indonesia, the Moluccas, the Maluku Islands, jewels of green set in warm seas. That was where the real fortune seemed to lie. Pepper, nutmeg, mace, which is the lacy crimson webbing that wraps the nutmeg seed, cloves, dark and fragrant. In an age before refrigeration, before any easy way to keep food from turning, these flavors were worth more than their weight in almost anything. A man who could fill a hold with nutmeg and bring it safely back to London could make himself rich beyond reckoning. So east they sailed, not toward the textiles and the tax revenue and the throne of Bengal that none of them could foresee, but toward pepper and cloves, toward the spice that everyone believed was the whole point of the journey. But there was a problem waiting for them in those warm seas, and the problem had a name. The Dutch. 2 years after the English company was chartered, in 1602, the Dutch founded their own great trading enterprise, the VOK, the Dutch East India Company. And the Dutch were formidable, better organized, better financed, and willing to fight harder and more ruthlessly for the spice trade than the English were prepared to match. They out-muscled the newcomers from London again and again, edging them out of the best markets, the best islands, the richest sources of nutmeg and clove. The English found themselves the lesser power in a contest they had hoped to win, pushed always to the margins of the trade they had crossed the world to join. And then came the moment that decided everything, though no one understood at the time how much it would decide. In 1623, on the island of Amboyna, the Dutch seized and executed 10 Englishmen. The Amboyna massacre, history would come to call it. 10 men put to death by their Dutch rivals on a far-off island in the warm seas, accused and condemned and killed. And the message it sent across the water to London was unmistakable. The spice trade was the Dutch domain. It would be held by force, and the cost of contesting it would be paid in English lives. So the company turned away. It is one of those quiet hinges on which the whole vast story swings, almost without anyone noticing it turn. Beaten back from the Spice Islands, bruised by the Dutch, the merchants of London lifted their eyes from the Moluccas and looked instead toward the long coastline of the Indian subcontinent. Not for nutmeg now, not for cloves, for cloth, for the cotton and the calico and the muslin of India, fabrics finer than anything Europe could yet weave. It seemed at the time a retreat, a consolation prize, a second-best market for a company that had lost its first dream to a stronger rival. They could not have known that this defeat, this turning away in disappointment, was the very thing that would set their feet on the road to an empire. They thought they had lost the spice. What they had found, without yet understanding it, was India, and the road from those warm, contested seas now bends, slowly, toward the Mughal court and the forts that have not yet been built, and the warehouses that will one day stand heavy with cloth. But that is for the hours ahead. For now, let the islands fade. Let the ships turn west toward the coast of India in the soft dark and drift on with them, gently, toward whatever comes next. The coast of India, when you first approach it from the sea, comes to you gradually. Not all at once, not as a single dramatic revelation, but as a slow accumulation of signs. A change in the color of the water, a smell of rain and earth carried on the wind, the dark smudge on the horizon that takes hours to resolve itself into something you can call land. The men aboard those first English ships, turning away from the Spice Islands with their losses and their disappointment, would have stood at the railings and watched that coastline emerge with eyes that had not yet learned what they were looking at. They were looking for a market. They did not know they were looking at the place that would one day become, in the strained and extraordinary logic of commerce and violence, their inheritance. The first foothold was Surat, a port city on the northwestern coast of India, on the Gulf of Khambat, in the territory of the great Mughal Empire. An empire that in the early 17th century was one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated governing structures on earth, its revenues dwarfing anything the European kingdoms could claim, its cities home to hundreds of thousands of people when London was still a modest thing by comparison. The Mughal emperor at this time was Jahangir, the fourth of his line, a man of considerable cultivation and considerable complexity, fond of painting and wine and the natural world, ruling a domain that stretched from Kabul in the northwest to Bengal in the east. And it was into the antechambers of his court, eventually, that the company would have to go, not with armies, not with threats, but with the careful and patient grammar of trade. The company established its first factory at Surat in 1613. The word factory, in this older sense, does not mean a place of manufacturing. It means a trading post, a base of operations, a building, or a cluster of building, where the company's agents, called factors, could live and store goods and conduct their negotiations. A house of commerce, on foreign soil, in the shadow of a power so much greater than their own that the comparison barely makes sense. The company at Surat was a petitioner, a guest, a tenant by sufferance. The Mughals did not need the English needed the Mughals to let them stay, and so the company sent an ambassador. His name was Sir Thomas Roe, a diplomat of some distinction, and he arrived at the Mughal court in 1615 and remained until 1619, 4 years. 4 years of patience and negotiation and the careful performance of courtesy in a court whose protocols he was learning as he went. Roe was a perceptive man, and his letters home are full of careful observation about the Mughal court's magnificence, about Jahangir's personality, about the enormous difficulty of negotiating from a position of weakness with a sovereign who had no particular reason to treat you as an equal. He understood, with a clarity that not everyone in London shared, that the company could not muscle its way into India as it had briefly dreamed of doing in the Spice Islands. It had to earn its place. What Roe secured eventually was a degree of formal recognition, not a sweeping trade treaty, not guaranteed access to the whole empire, but enough. Permission to trade, protection, in principle, for the company's merchants and goods. A foothold, modest and precarious, on the edges of the Mughal world. It was a beginning. And from beginnings, if patience holds and the opportunity arises, other things grow. Surat was the first. Then came the others, each one a small drama of its own, each one a piece of the map that would slowly, over decades, resolve itself into something none of its builders had intended. To understand the company, to really understand what it became and why, you have to hold these 3 places in mind simultaneously, because they are the skeleton on which the whole body of company power was eventually hung. 3 cities, 3 forts, each acquired differently, each becoming something different, and together forming the triangle inside which an empire would eventually take shape. The first was Madras on the southeastern coast, the Coromandel coast as it was called. The company built Fort St. George there between 1639 and 1640 on land leased from a local Nayak ruler, a small Indian kingdom, a local power willing to tolerate and indeed to profit from the presence of these English traders on its margins. Fort St. George was modest in its beginnings. A fortified trading post, walls thick enough to offer some protection, warehouses inside for the goods, a small residential settlement growing around it. In time, the city of Madras, modern Chennai, would grow from this beginning, but that time was long away. In 1639, it was simply a patch of leased ground with a building on it, a long way from home, in a climate that killed Englishmen with regularity. The second was Bombay, and its story is stranger and in some ways more revealing. Bombay came to the company not through trade or negotiation, but through a marriage, or rather through the portion that accompanied a marriage. In 1661, King Charles II of England married Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess, and among the various territories and rights that came as her dowry, the island of Bombay was one. It passed from Portugal to the English crown, and then in 1668 the crown decided it had little use for this distant island, a malarial, difficult place, expensive to maintain and defend, and transferred it to the company for the sum of £10 a year, £10 annually in rent for what would eventually become one of the great cities of the world. At the time, it seemed a reasonable enough bargain for both sides. The crown was rid of an inconvenient possession. The company had a natural harbour on the western coast of India, deep enough for large ships, sheltered, strategically placed. They did not know yet what they had. They rarely did in the beginning. The third was Calcutta, and Calcutta's origins have a slightly shambolic quality that feels, looking back, entirely appropriate for a city that would eventually become the capital of company power in India. The site was chosen and settled by a company agent named Job Charnock in 1690. Though the history is tangled enough that Charnock's exact role has been disputed, and the city's founding is contested in ways that mirror, in miniature, the larger disputes about everything the company did. What is not disputed is that the settlement grew, that Fort William was built there in the years that followed, and that Calcutta's position on the Hooghly River, a branch of the Ganges Delta, navigable, accessible from the Bay of Bengal, made it commercially extraordinary. It was the gateway to Bengal, and Bengal was, in terms of agricultural wealth and textile production and population, among the richest territories in the entire subcontinent. Charnock chose well, even if he barely knew what he was choosing. But between those three forts and the reality of power lay decades of something quieter and, in its way, more consequential than any battle. What the company did for most of the 17th century and well into the 18th was trade. And what it traded above all else was cloth. The spices were the dream. Cloth was the reality. And cloth, it turned out, was a stranger and more transformative commerce than anyone had anticipated, because it did not merely enrich the company, it changed England itself and planted seeds that would eventually flower into the Industrial Revolution, though that flowering was still a long way off. The textiles of India were unlike anything England's own weavers could produce. Cotton, first of all, a fibre that English manufacturing had barely touched, still dominated by wool and by imported silk. But it was not merely cotton in the abstract, it was the specific, extraordinary things that Indian craftspeople did with cotton. Muslin, so fine, so light, so almost transparently delicate that contemporaries compared it to woven air, to fog-given texture, to something that seemed impossible to produce with human hands and thread. Calico, named for the city of Calicut on the Malabar coast, a sturdy, printable cotton cloth that came in an almost unlimited variety of colors and patterns. Chintz, the word from the Hindi and Sanskrit chart meaning spotted or variegated, a glazed cotton printed with flowers and birds and intricate designs in colors that the European eye found irresistible. These fabrics arrived in England and caused something close to a sensation. They were cheaper than wool for everyday use, they were more comfortable in warm weather, they could be washed more easily, and they were, in the eyes of fashionable England, beautiful in a way that domestic cloth simply was not. By the late 17th century, Indian textiles were everywhere, in dress fabrics, in furnishings, in the upholstery of chairs and the curtains of windows, in the bed coverings of people who could afford a touch of the exotic in their domestic lives. The company was importing them by the shipload and profiting enormously. But the English wool and silk weavers, watching this tide of imported cotton transform the market, were not merely watching it with admiration. They were watching it with something closer to terror. Their trade was threatened, their livelihoods were under pressure from a flood of foreign goods that were better made and more attractive and cheaper to buy than anything they could produce. And they did what threatened industries have always done. They went to Parliament. Parliament listened. In 1700 it passed the first Calico Act, prohibiting the import of certain Indian cotton fabrics, and then in 1721 it passed a second, more sweeping restriction, banning the wearing of printed or dyed calico in England. You could own it perhaps if you had bought it before the Act, but to wear it was to break the law. The protection was imperfect, the enforcement patchy, and the smuggling of Indian textiles continued at a considerable scale. But the gesture was clear. England was trying to protect its traditional industries from the disruptive force of a better foreign product. The irony, and it is a deep and instructive irony, is that this very protectionism helped push English manufacturers to find ways to replicate what they could no longer easily import. The pressure to produce cotton cloth without access to the Indian original drove investment and experiment and innovation in the English textile industry. The water frames and spinning jennies and power looms that would transform the north of England in the decades to come. Those machines, and the fortunes they would eventually generate, had their roots, in part, in this enforced necessity. The East India Company, by bringing Indian cloth to England and triggering the backlash that came after, helped set in motion a chain of events that would produce the Industrial Revolution. The cotton that England could not buy from India, it would eventually make itself, and on an industrial scale that would eventually undercut the very Indian producers who had started the whole chain of causation. History has this quality sometimes of moving in loops that only become visible when you stand at a certain distance. And in the meantime, the cloth trade left its marks on the English language in ways that are still there, quietly embedded in words used every day without any thought of their origin. Calico, from Calicut, the city. Chintz, from the Hindi word for spotted. Pajamas, from the Urdu and Persian pajama, leg garment, the loose trousers worn across much of South Asia that English merchants encountered and eventually adopted into their own wardrobe vocabulary. Khaki, from the Urdu khaki, meaning dusty or dust-coloured, the colour of the Indian terrain that the company's soldiers eventually wore in their field campaigns. Dungaree, from the Hindi dungri, a coarse cotton cloth made near Bombay. Seersucker, from the Persian shiro shakar, milk and sugar, named for the alternating smooth and puckered stripes of the fabric. Bandana, shawl. And perhaps most strikingly, most revealingly of all, loot. From the Hindi loot, meaning plunder, the act of taking what does not belong to you by force. That word entered English through the commerce of the company, through the campaigns and the extractions, and the enormous and systematic taking that would characterize the company's operations as it moved from trader to ruler. The language remembered, even when the histories forgot. But the road to ruling was still ahead. For most of the 17th century and into the first half of the 18th, the company was what it had been chartered to be, a trading enterprise operating in a Mughal world that tolerated it, negotiating its positions, managing its forts, sending ships heavy with cloth back and forth across the Indian Ocean. It had its own soldiers, small garrisons to protect its warehouses and trading posts, but it was not yet an army in any meaningful sense. It was a company of merchants. The power it exercised was the power of commerce, of credit, of the cargo manifest. And then, in the middle of the 18th century, the Mughal Empire began to fracture. The death of the Emperor Aurangzeb in 1707 is usually taken as the beginning of the Mughal decline. A slow, uneven, contested dissolution rather than a sudden collapse, as competing successors fought for the throne, and the provincial governors who had ruled in the emperor's name began to assert their independence. The Nawabs, the provincial governors of Bengal, of Hyderabad, of Awadh, became powers in their own right, still nominally acknowledging Mughal authority, but increasingly making their own decisions, waging their own wars, conducting their own foreign policies. Into this fracturing world the company watched and waited and slowly, carefully began to arm itself more seriously. The immediate trigger for what happened next came from Bengal. In June of 1756, the young Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, 20-something years old, headstrong and suspicious and facing real threats on multiple sides, marched on the company's settlement at Calcutta. The company's fort there had been strengthened without his permission, in violation of the agreements under which the company was permitted to operate in his territory. He regarded this as a provocation, and he was not entirely wrong to do so. He took Calcutta easily. The company's forces fled, the governor sailed away, and in the aftermath of the capture, a number of British prisoners were confined overnight in a small cell in the fort. What happened to those prisoners has been disputed ever since. The account that entered popular history, the account that the company propagated vigorously back in London, that was used to justify everything that came afterward, came from a man named John Zephaniah Holwell, a survivor of the night who wrote that 146 prisoners had been placed in a room so small and so poorly ventilated that by morning 123 of them had suffocated to death. A single cell known afterward as the Black Hole of Calcutta. A number, 123 dead, so large and so viscerally horrible that it produced outrage in England and gave the company the moral warrant it needed for a response. But the number does not hold up. Modern historians, examining the available evidence with considerably more care than Holwell's contemporaries did, have found it almost certainly exaggerated. Holwell was the sole significant source for his own account. The physical dimensions of the cell in question make the figure implausible. The death toll, if there was a death toll, and there was almost certainly some suffering, some deaths, was probably a fraction of what he claimed. Some historians question the basic shape of the incident. It is one of those episodes where the propaganda overwhelmed the record and shaped the understanding of millions of people for generations, which is, in its way, exactly what Holwell intended. The Black Hole of Calcutta was a story the company needed, and so it became the story everyone told. What followed was real enough, regardless of the propaganda. Robert Clive, a company man who had already made a considerable reputation in the Carnatic Wars on the southeastern coast, sailed with a force from Madras, retook Calcutta, and then turned his attention to the Nawab. And here is where the story takes the turn that makes it, in retrospect, so perfectly illustrative of what the company was and how it operated. The Battle of Plassey, when it came, was not quite what it appeared to be. 23rd of June, 1757. A mango grove near the village of Plassey on the banks of the Bhagirathi River in Bengal, a day's travel south of Murshidabad. On one side, the company's forces under Clive, roughly 3,000 men, a combination of British soldiers and Indian sepoys with a small artillery train. Sepoy, the word itself worth pausing on, from the Persian and Urdu sipahi, meaning soldier or horseman. Indian infantry recruited and trained by the company, armed and drilled on European lines, the human material from which the company's army was built. On the other side, the Nawab's forces, estimates vary, but the order of magnitude is around 50,000 with cavalry and artillery including French-supplied guns, a force that on paper should have made the outcome obvious. But the outcome had been decided weeks earlier, in correspondence and in the exchange of promises and payments, because Clive had been in contact with Mir Jafar, the Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah's own military commander, the man who commanded the largest contingent of the Nawab's army. And Mir Jafar had made a bargain. He would hold his troops back. He would not commit his forces to the Nawab's defense. In exchange, the company would make him Nawab when the battle was over. The negotiation was not simple or without its own anxieties. Clive had signed a forged document as part of the machinations, something that later troubled even him. But the essential deal was struck. When the battle came, Mir Jafar's contingent, the largest in the Nawab's army, stood aside. The battle itself lasted a few hours. The monsoon came, briefly, and rain poured down over the field, wetting the Nawab's powder. His artillery fell silent. The company's men had kept their ammunition dry under tarpaulins. The fighting was real in its way, and men died on both sides, but the outcome was foregone. The Nawab's army, betrayed from within, confused and leaderless at the critical moment, broke. Siraj-ud-Dowlah fled and was later killed. Mir Jafar was installed as the new Nawab of Bengal, exactly as promised. The company had gained, in an afternoon, the control of the most wealthy province in the Indian subcontinent. Bengal, with its enormous agricultural output, its textile industries, its river trade, its vast population, was now under the effective governance of a man who owed his position to the company and could not survive without its support. A puppet the word that historians have used and that the situation clearly supports. Mir Jafar was the Nawab, but it was the company that held the strings. And then came the payment. Because this was the company, and the company was a commercial enterprise answerable to shareholders, and everything it did, even the winning of an empire, had to be denominated in money eventually. The settlement that followed Plassey was extraordinary in its scale. The new Nawab was required to pay enormous sums to the company, to the individual soldiers who had fought, to the trading community that had suffered losses in the conflict. And Robert Clive, the man who had arranged the whole affair, took his share. His personal payment, drawn from the Nawab's treasury, from the wealth of Bengal, was approximately £234,000 in the currency of 1757, which translates into tens of millions in any modern reckoning, though the comparison is imperfect because money meant something different in a world without most of what money is now spent on. It was a fortune by any measure, an almost incomprehensible fortune for a man who had arrived in India as a clerk's assistant, who had once tried to shoot himself when the misery of his early years there had seemed insupportable, and who had survived to find himself standing in the ruins of a Nawab's power with the wealth of Bengal flowing toward him. And beyond the immediate payment, Clive received something more, a jagir, a grant of land revenue worth approximately $27,000 a year. An annual income, not a one-time payment. A stream of money flowing from Indian soil year after year to an Englishman in a building on a London street. The word jagir, a Persian and Urdu term from jah, meaning place, and gur meaning holder, a grant of the right to collect revenue from a particular territory, had existed for centuries in the Mughal administrative system, a way of compensating officials and military commanders with income from land rather than with salary. It was an Indian institution, a Mughal instrument, and now a company man was holding one. The worlds had begun to interpenetrate in ways that would only deepen in the years to come. Clive went home to England eventually, and what he brought with him, the wealth, the 234,000, the jagir income, was the thing that England noticed and talked about and argued over. Here was a man who had gone out as a clerk and come back as a grandee, richer than most of the aristocracy that had never left its estates, buying land and property and influence with money that had come from somewhere very far away. He was not alone. He was the most famous, the most spectacular example, but he was one of many. The company's servants in India, the factors, the junior merchants, the military officers, had been finding ways to enrich themselves through the commerce and the corruption and the sheer proximity to enormous wealth that Indian trade represented. The more the company's power grew, the more opportunities there were, and the more money flowed back to England in the hands of men who had spent their working years on the other side of the world. They had a name for these returning men, coined with a mixture of envy and contempt by the English people who watched them arrive. Nabobs. The word was a corruption of Nawab, the Indian provincial governor, the Mughal grandee, applied to Englishmen who had come back from India with Indian-scale fortunes and the manners, or the lack of manners, that seemed to go with that kind of money. Nabobs bought estates in the English countryside. They bought rotten boroughs and placed themselves in Parliament. They built houses that were a little too grand and furnished them with objects that were a little too exotic, and threw parties that were a little too lavish, and they became, in the cultural imagination of 18th century England, a symbol of something uncomfortable and perhaps corrupting. The idea that wealth from far away, wealth acquired through means that polite society preferred not to examine too carefully, was now flowing into the veins of English life and changing it in ways that were hard to name but impossible to ignore. And behind all the individual fortunes, behind all the nabobs and their country houses and their purchased seats in Parliament, was the company itself, the institution that had made all of it possible, that had created the conditions in which a clerk could become a grandee, in which a trading post could become a military power, in which the most extraordinary transfer of wealth in the history of European commerce was being quietly, systematically arranged. It was still officially a trading company. The Royal Charter said so. The legal documents said so. The shareholders meeting at East India House on Leadenhall Street in the City of London were, in theory, meeting to discuss dividends from commerce, the buying and selling of goods. That was what the company was for. That was what it had been given its monopoly to do. But something had changed at Plassey. Something had changed in the months and years since the mango grove and the betrayal and the installation of a puppet Nawab with the company's hand inside him. The company had tasted something that was not quite trade, not quite the patient grammar of factors and warehouses and cargo manifests. It had tasted the thing that came before all of that. The power to decide who governed, the power to take, the power that in any other context would have been called sovereignty. And having tasted it, it would find the old flavor of mere commerce increasingly insufficient. But that fuller transformation which did the legal, the fiscal, the military, the catastrophic, is for what comes next. For now, the evening is deepening. The ships are heavy with cloth and money and the beginnings of something that nobody in London has quite understood yet. And somewhere on the Hooghly River, in the city that Job Charnock built, the lamps of Fort William are burning in the warm dark over Bengal. The Battle of Buxar is not a name that lives in the popular memory the way Plassey does, and that is a strange omission because in a very real sense, Buxar was the more consequential battle, the one that completed what Plassey had begun, the one that moved the East India Company from a corporation with military reach into something for which the English language did not yet have a clean word. Plassey, in June of 1757, had been a victory secured by bribery, a battle won before it was fought, the outcome arranged in the small hours of the night through whispered negotiation and the promise of a throne. It had given the company Mir Jafar as its puppet in Bengal, and through Mir Jafar it had extracted payments of staggering personal size. Robert Clive's $234,000, his jagir worth around $27,000 a year, and a cascading series of gifts and extractions that flowed from Fort William outward to the officers and directors and agents of a corporation that had discovered what conquest tasted like. But Plassey was, in the language of the law, still a military intervention in someone else's political dispute. The company had not claimed Bengal. It had simply installed the ruler of its choosing and arranged, quietly, to be compensated for the trouble. What happened at Buxar in October of 1764 was different in its texture and in its consequence. The puppet had proved ungrateful, as puppets sometimes do. Mir Jafar, installed on the Nawab's throne by company arms, had found the position less comfortable than anticipated, surrounded by company agents demanding he continue paying and deferring and accommodating, unable to make a decision about his own treasury without English eyes on it. He had been replaced, maneuvered out, and then partially back in the grinding calculus of company politics, until the situation in Bengal had become a kind of slow-motion disorder. Multiple claimants, multiple debts, and the company's own servants growing fantastically rich in ways that made even the directors in London uncomfortable. And in 1764 a coalition formed against the company that was, on paper, formidable. Mir Qasim, who had succeeded Mir Jafar as Nawab of Bengal, joined forces with the Nawab of Awadh, a neighbouring large and wealthy state in the north, and with Shah Alam II himself, the Mughal emperor, the theoretical sovereign over the entire subcontinent, ruler of the dynasty that had governed India for 2 centuries. 3 powers, the Nawab of Bengal, the Nawab of Awadh, and the Mughal emperor, against one trading company. The battle was fought at Buxar in Bihar on 22nd October 1764. The company's forces, commanded by Hector Munro, defeated the coalition. The engagement was harder fought than Plassey. This was not a stage-managed betrayal with one side's general already bought. This was a genuine military encounter with real casualties on both sides. But the outcome was the same. The coalition dissolved. The Nawab of Awadh sought terms, and the Mughal emperor, Shah Alam II, found himself in the strange and humbling position of a man who had just lost a battle to a corporation. And then came the consequence that made Buxar the hinge of the whole story. In August of 1765, Robert Clive, who had returned to India for a second tenure, summoned back because the situation in Bengal had become ungovernable by lesser men, met with Shah Alam II at Allahabad. And in that meeting, the Mughal emperor, in exchange for the company's protection and a guaranteed pension, signed over something called the Diwani. The Diwani was a Persian word for a right. Specifically, it was the right to collect land revenue and civil taxes across the provinces of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Not the right to govern exactly, but not the right to run the courts, or command the armies or conduct diplomacy, which remained nominally in the hands of Indian officials. Just the right to collect the money. To be the entity that gathered from approximately 20 million people the annual flow of taxes and revenue that had for generations sustained the Mughal administration and the Nawab's court and the functioning of civil society in one of the most populous and agriculturally productive regions on earth. Consider what that meant in practical terms. Consider it slowly, because it is easy to let the word slide past without grasping the thing it described. The company was a trading firm. It had shareholders. It had a board of directors. It held meetings at East India House on Leadenhall Street where men in wigs and frock coats discussed the price of calico and the expected return on the next season's pepper cargo. Its legal identity was that of a merchant enterprise, granted a monopoly by a royal charter to conduct trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. That was what it was. And now, through a document signed by a weakened emperor sitting under the formal protection of company bayonets, it had become the tax government of Bengal. Not a colony, not quite. The Mughal emperor was still nominally the emperor. The Indian officials called Nizamat were still nominally responsible for civil administration and justice. The fiction of existing Mughal authority was carefully, deliberately preserved because it was useful. It provided a legal framework that let the company say, truthfully in the narrowest technical sense, that it was acting within the established order of Indian governance, not replacing it. But the Diwani meant the money flowed to Leadenhall Street. The revenue of Bengal, but the annual yield of some of the richest agricultural land in Asia, a river delta that produced rice and silk and cotton in abundance, a territory that European observers had long described with something close to awe, now passed through company hands before going anywhere else, and the implications spiraled outward from that single fact in ways that took years to fully unfold, but that were, in retrospect, almost inevitable from the moment the ink dried. The company could now fund its own operations in India using Indian revenue rather than silver shipped from Britain. This was the hidden transformation inside the legal document. Before the Diwani, every company purchase in India, every bale of muslin, every chest of indigo, every consignment of silk had to be paid for with money sent from England. Silver crossed the oceans. Investors provided capital. The company traded. That was the mechanism, and it was a mechanism with real costs and real constraints. After the Diwani, the mechanism changed. The company collected taxes from 20 million people, used a portion of that revenue to buy Indian goods, the textiles, the saltpeter, the commodities its shareholders expected, and shipped those goods back to London, where they were sold for profit. The revenue of Bengal was funding the purchase of goods that were then sold in England to generate returns for English shareholders. The people being taxed were, in effect, financing the company's commercial operation. They were paying for the cloth that was being taken from them. This was the thing that Clive understood, and that he described with a frankness that should give anyone pause. He called it, approximately, the ability to carry on the trade of the company without the necessity of sending out treasure from England. The words are calm and managerial. The reality they described was something else. But the Diwani created a problem that was less obvious in the moment of triumph. It created a gap, a structural gap, between the entity that collected the revenue and the entity responsible for governing the people from whom that revenue was collected. The company now had money rights, but not the responsibility, or not the acknowledged responsibility, for what happened to the 20 million people whose fields and labor generated that money. The existing Indian administrative apparatus remained nominally in place, underfunded, its authority hollowed out from beneath, its relationship to the population disrupted by the insertion of a new and purely extractive layer at the top of the fiscal system. The company was taking the money. The question of what returned to the land and the people, the roads, the granaries, the maintenance of irrigation systems that kept Bengal's extraordinary agricultural productivity functioning, was being answered, in practice, by nobody in particular. And then the rains failed. The monsoon of 1769 was inadequate in a subsistence agricultural economy, and Bengal, despite its textile wealth, was fundamentally an economy in which most of the population farmed and survived on what they grew. An inadequate monsoon was not merely an inconvenience, it was the beginning of a threat to survival. And when the rains of 1770 were also poor, the threat became catastrophe. What followed is known as the Bengal Famine of 1769 to 1773, though the worst of it fell in 1770. The death toll is an estimate, and it is important to say that clearly, the precision implied by a single number should not be mistaken for certainty. The scale, however, the rough and terrible order of magnitude, is accepted by historians, approximately 10 million people. 1/3 of the population of Bengal, 10 million people, in 4 years, dead. 10 million is a number that resists imagination, which may be why it so often slips past us as a statistic. Think of it differently. Imagine every person in a city the size of London and Paris combined, and then imagine them gone. Or think of it this way. In a territory where 3 people had been living and working and eating and raising children, now 2 remained. 1/3 of everyone gone in 4 years. From hunger and from the diseases that follow hunger, the weakened bodies, the contaminated water, the collapse of what little medical and social infrastructure existed. The drought triggered the famine. No one disputes that. But what company policy did with the drought is a different question, and it is one that the historical record answers with uncomfortable clarity. Revenue collection continued. Through the famine, through the dying, through the abandonment of fields and the flight of farming families from villages that could no longer sustain them, the company's revenue apparatus kept collecting. The demand for taxes did not fall proportionally with the population's ability to pay. In some accounts, the demand actually increased as the company struggled to maintain its revenue figures against the declining productive capacity of a starving countryside. Grain speculation by company servants, individuals within the organization who understood that scarcity meant rising prices and who positioned themselves to profit from it, removed food from circulation at the very moment when circulation was survival. There is a passage sometimes cited from a letter of the period, the phrase, "the Gentoos are dying very fast." Gentoo was the term company men used for Hindu Indians. The dying was noted. It was noted as a fact of the landscape, the way a merchant notes weather, relevant to commerce, unfortunate but external to the system. The system continued. The famine eventually exhausted itself, as famines do. The rains returned, partially. The remaining population reorganized. Bengal slowly, painfully, began to recover its productive capacity. But it recovered into a territory that had lost a third of its people, that had its agricultural capacity severely disrupted, that had seen a decade of revenue extraction without reinvestment, and that was now more firmly than ever under the management of a corporation whose primary obligation was to shareholders in London. And the famine, which had devastated Bengal, had also devastated the company's revenues, because you cannot indefinitely tax people who are dying, and because even those who survived had less to tax. The contradiction at the heart of pure extraction, that it destroys the productive capacity it feeds on, arrived, as it always does, eventually. The company's finances, already complicated by the enormous cost of its military campaigns and by the personal extractions of its servants in India, began to look genuinely alarming, but that financial reckoning belongs to what comes next. For now there is still the army. The army is the other side of the Diwani, the other implication that grew from the moment of the Allahabad settlement. The right to collect taxes required the ability to enforce collection, and the enforcement of collection across an enormous and only partially pacified territory required soldiers. A lot of soldiers. And the company, which had begun with a handful of guards at its trading posts, which had gradually acquired the right to maintain troops as protection for its factories, which had discovered at Plassey that military force was the lever that moved the subcontinent. The company had been building an army for decades, and now it had the revenue to build a very large one indeed. By the early decades of the 19th century, the company's army in India numbered something in the region of 250,000 men, 250,000 soldiers. To understand the scale of that number, consider this. At the same period, the standing army of Great Britain, the King's Army, the official armed force of the nation that had chartered the company, the military of one of the most powerful states in Europe, numbered roughly half that. The company, a private corporation run by a board of directors, fielded an army twice the size of Britain's own. The majority of these soldiers were Indian. They were called sepoys, a word that came into English from the Hindi sipahi, itself borrowed from the Persian for soldier. The sepoys were professional soldiers recruited from particular communities and castes across the subcontinent, Rajputs and Brahmins from Awadh, Bengalis, Marathas, Sikhs in later decades, trained to European military discipline, organized into regiments, and commanded at the officer level by Britons. The relationship between the sepoy and the company was complex and layered. It involved professional pride, religious and caste identity, questions of honor and obligation that the company's British officers sometimes understood and sometimes catastrophically failed to understand. The sepoys were not simply hired mercenaries. They were soldiers with their own culture, their own sense of the terms of their service, and their own limits. But for most of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the army worked. It fought and it won. It fought a series of wars across the subcontinent that expanded the territory under company control in ways that the directors back in London sometimes deplored. Military adventure was expensive, and there were men on the court of directors who would have preferred to simply trade. But that kept happening nonetheless, driven by the logic of frontier insecurity, the logic of rival powers, the logic of a corporation that could not easily stop acquiring because each acquisition created a new frontier that required securing. The wars against Mysore were among the longest and most serious. Hyder Ali was a military commander of remarkable ability who had risen to effective control of the Kingdom of Mysore in southern India in the 1760s. He was not a hereditary ruler. He had made himself through force of will and military genius, which made him, to the company, simultaneously admirable and threatening. He understood European military organization and adapted it for his own forces. He was resourceful, aggressive, and deeply hostile to the company's expanding presence in the south. His son, Tipu Sultan, was more than his inheritor. Tipu Sultan was the kind of figure who seems, in retrospect, to have been genuinely too interesting for the world he lived in, a monarch who planted a liberty tree in the French revolutionary style, who corresponded with Napoleon, who dreamed of European alliances against British power, and who poured genuine intellectual energy and state resources into military innovation. The Mysorean war rockets that Tipu's forces deployed in battle were not metaphors or exaggerations. They were iron-cased cylinders packed with propellant attached to bamboo stabilizing poles, capable of carrying incendiary material or blades across open ground. They were, in the history of military technology, a genuine achievement, a systematized battlefield use of rocketry that preceded anything comparable in Europe. When the company's forces eventually overwhelmed Mysore and looted Tipu's arsenals, the rocket technology was studied carefully. The Congreve rocket, which British forces used in the early 19th century, including in the bombardment of Baltimore in 1814, the battle that produced the phrase, "the rocket's red glare," in what became the American national anthem, was developed, at least in part, from analysis of what Tipu Sultan's engineers had built. That is not a footnote. It is a thread running through the history of technology, of empire, and of a corporation whose military wing was willing to learn from whoever it fought. Tipu Sultan died defending Seringapatam on 4 May 1799. The siege of Seringapatam was one of the set-piece military events of the era. A British force under Richard Wellesley, whose younger brother Arthur would later be known as the Duke of Wellington, breached the walls and took the fortress in a matter of hours. Tipu was found in the rubble, still armed, dead with his weapons in his hands. He had been offered terms. He had refused them. Among the objects looted from Seringapatam in the aftermath of its fall was a remarkable thing. A wooden automaton, perhaps 1.5 meters long, in the shape of a tiger mauling a European soldier. Inside the body of the tiger was a small mechanical organ, a set of pipes and bellows operated by a hand crank that produced, when turned, a sound meant to simulate the cries of the dying man and the growling of the beast, Tipu's tiger. It had sat in Tipu Sultan's audience chamber, a statement of intent in carved and painted wood, a piece of political theatre in the form of a toy that was also a message. It had presumably delighted Tipu, who had a taste for the theatrical and who had reason to want to imagine British officers in precisely that position. It is now in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, where it has sat since 1808. You can go and see it. Visitors, according to those who work there, sometimes turn the crank and listen to the organ's wheezing simulation of death and appetite, the little sound it makes in a room full of tourists and school children, the trophy of a defeated king in the museum of a nation that defeated him, producing its sound for whoever is curious enough to turn the handle. There were 4 Anglo-Mysore wars in total, stretching from 1767 to 1799, by the end of which Mysore was under company control. There were 3 Anglo-Maratha wars against the Maratha Confederacy that controlled much of central and western India, a powerful, sophisticated political entity that required decades of campaigning to eventually break, ending with the Third Anglo-Maratha War of 1817 to 1818. There were the Anglo-Sikh Wars in the 1840s that brought the Punjab under company dominion. Each war cost money. Each war was justified to the directors in London as defensive necessity, as response to provocation, as the regrettable but unavoidable logic of a frontier that could not be left unsecured. Each war, having been won, created a new frontier. The men who had to approve the spending of the money, and who sometimes did so with audible anxiety and occasional explicit disapproval, were the directors sitting at East India House on Leadenhall Street. And they were approving it because the alternative, withdrawing, leaving the territory, abandoning the revenue streams that were now part of the company's financial structure, was, practically speaking, not something the corporation's balance sheet could absorb. The army was expensive, but the army was also, in the most literal sense, what the revenue depended on. The company had walked into a logic it could not easily walk out of. And while all of this was happening on the plains and in the hills and along the rivers of the subcontinent, something was happening in England that was, in its quieter way, just as significant. They were coming home. The men who had served the company in India, the factors and traders and officers and administrators, the men who had spent years or decades in the service of a corporation that was also increasingly a government, were returning to England with fortunes. In many cases, very large fortunes. Fortunes generated not only by the legitimate trade that was their ostensible purpose, but by the personal extractions and gifts and bribes and side arrangements that the company's chaotic and under-supervised structure had made almost impossible to prevent. The private trade conducted on the side by company servants, the gifts received in the course of business from Indian rulers and merchants eager to maintain good relations with men who now wielded something close to governmental power, the straightforward corruption sometimes of men who understood that they were far from oversight and that the opportunity would not last. These men had a name in England. They were called nabobs, the word a corruption of nawab, the Mughal term for a provincial governor, the title of the men the company was busy installing and removing and controlling. A nabob was a company man returned rich, a man who had come home from the East smelling of a particular combination of money and excess and something that polite society found it difficult to look at directly. They bought things, country estates in England and Scotland, the markers of landed gentry status in a society where land was the fundamental unit of social legitimacy. They bought parliamentary seats. In the 18th century English political system, many constituencies were effectively for sale, and a man with sufficient money could make himself a member of parliament without inconvenience. They entered society, married into established families, built houses and filled them with the objects they had brought back from India: the furniture, the textiles, the silverware, the paintings, the exotic artifacts of a world that most of their neighbors would never see. And they made people uncomfortable, not always because of the corruption, though that was part of it, because of the scale, because of the visibility of the wealth and the sense which English society of the period registered with something between fascination and unease, that this money had not been made in any way that the existing categories of gentlemanly commerce quite covered. A merchant made his money through trade, a landowner made his from his estates, a banker through finance. But a nabob had made his through what exactly? Through governing, through war, through the extraction of revenue from populations that had not consented to be governed by a corporation. These questions were not always asked in those precise terms, but they were felt. The nabob was a figure of satire in the literature and theatre of the period, a walking embodiment of the question the company was posing to English society. What exactly are we doing out there, and what does it mean that the money from it flows here? Robert Clive himself was the original and greatest nabob, and his story contains the thing in miniature. He returned to England, built his fortune, bought his estates, entered Parliament. He was investigated by Parliament on multiple occasions over the nature of his personal gains in India, and the investigations created the strange spectacle of a man who had won an empire for his country being asked to justify how he had profited from the winning. In his defense, Clive is reported to have surveyed the investigating committee with something approaching disbelief and said words to the effect that when he considered the opportunities available to him, when he stood before the wealth of Bengal and its masters, he was astonished at his own moderation. He died in 1774. The exact circumstances are disputed. Some contemporaries and later historians believed he took his own life. The official account was more ambiguous. He was 49. He had won an empire, extracted an enormous personal fortune from its winning, been celebrated and investigated in roughly equal measure, and died before what he had set in motion in Bengal had fully revealed its shape. But the shape was beginning to show, and it showed most clearly not in the palaces of the nabobs or in the chambers of parliament, but in what had happened to Bengal itself, to the land along the Hooghly River and the Ganges Delta, to the people who had been there before any of this began, and who remained there through all of it, watching and paying. The Diwani had made the company the tax collector of Bengal. The Bengal famine had shown what a tax collector that felt no obligation to the people it taxed would do in a crisis. And the army, that 250,000-man instrument of control, twice the size of Britain's own, its costs running through the company's accounts year after year, had demonstrated the scale of the investment the company was now committed to defending. The investment in territory, the investment in the fiction of sovereign right exercised through commercial paperwork, and the bayonets of sepoys who had been recruited with promises of professional honor and regular pay. None of the men making these decisions in London, sitting in the parlours of East India House and debating the quarterly accounts, were monsters in the simple sense. Some were greedy, some were venal, some were genuinely convinced that what the company was doing was, in the balance, a form of order in places that had been troubled before the company arrived. Some were simply men with fiduciary duties, obligations to shareholders, to the investors who had put money into company stock and expected a return, and who pursued those duties through the mechanisms available without looking too carefully at what the mechanisms were doing at the other end. But the mechanisms were doing something. The mechanisms were collecting revenue from people who were sometimes starving. The mechanisms were fielding armies that were conquering territory and placing it under the control of a board of directors in the City of London. The mechanisms were taking the silk and the cotton and the indigo and the opium, but that is the next part of the story, and shipping them west and taking the money from the west and shipping it to the shareholders and calling this process trade. The East India Company had been chartered as a trading enterprise. It had become, by the last years of the 18th century, something that European political philosophy did not yet have a tidy word for. Not quite a state, not quite a corporation, something in between. A hybrid that combined the revenue collecting and military power of a government with the accountability structure of a joint stock enterprise, which is to say, accountability to people who owned shares, not to people who lived on the land. It governed approximately 60 million people, and its shareholders, meeting at East India House on Leadenhall Street, were expecting their dividends. The dividends had to come from somewhere, and the somewhere, the revenue of Bengal, the proceeds of the textile trade, the returns on the military campaigns, was under increasing strain. The famine had disrupted the revenue base. The wars were expensive. The personal extractions of company servants had diverted money away from the corporate accounts into private pockets at a scale that was becoming impossible to ignore. And in London, the financial system that underpinned the company's credit was beginning to make sounds that should have alarmed anyone paying close attention. Company stock was not merely a commercial investment. By the middle of the 18th century, it had become something woven into the broader English financial system, a major asset on the London market, held by thousands of investors, used as collateral, traded and speculated upon in ways that meant its health was not merely the concern of the company's own shareholders, but of the broader English economy. The Bank of England held company stock. Trusts and estates held company stock. The financial stability of a great many people who had never been anywhere near India depended in ways they may not have fully understood on the performance of a corporation that was now simultaneously a textile trader, a military power, and the government of Bengal. And that corporation, despite all it controlled, was running out of money. The famine's revenue collapse had hit hard. The costs of maintaining the army, the 250,000 men, the officers, the supplies, the fortifications, were relentless. The personal corruption of company servants had drained the accounts at the edges. The stock price was under pressure. And in 1772, a broader credit crisis in Britain, a contraction of the financial system of the kind that periodically convulsed the early modern European economy, made everything worse. Companies that had been borrowing to sustain their operations found credit suddenly scarce. Banks failed. And the East India Company, the largest and most powerful commercial enterprise in Britain's history, found itself unable to meet its obligations. It applied to the British government for a loan of $1.4 million. In the 21st century, we have a phrase for the situation the British government faced in that moment. We call it too big to fail. We mean an institution so large, so entangled with the broader economy, with so many creditors and shareholders and downstream dependencies that allowing it to collapse would cause damage to the financial system as a whole that would exceed the cost of rescuing it. The phrase was coined much later in a different era of financial crisis, but the logic was identical in 1772. The East India Company's collapse would have threatened the Bank of England. It would have ruined thousands of investors. It would have sent shockwaves through a financial system that was already fragile. And so the government, the Parliament, that had granted the original charter, that had watched the company grow into something far beyond what any charter had intended, stepped in. It gave the company the loan. And it demanded in return a price. The price was oversight. Parliament had watched for decades as a private corporation accumulated territories, revenues, armies, and the administrative apparatus of a state, and it had looked away for as long as looking away remained convenient. Now, with the bill for that inattention sitting on the table, a bill denominated in $1, 4 million, and an unknown number of Bengali dead, Parliament found that it could no longer quite justify the pretense that the company was simply a trading firm whose affairs were its own business. The Regulating Act of 1773 was the result. It was not a bold act of reform, it was a cautious act of damage limitation, drafted by men who were not sure how much they could interfere with a chartered corporation without setting uncomfortable precedents, and who were also not sure they wanted to know the full details of what had been done in Bengal. But it did two things that mattered. It created the post of Governor-General, a single supreme authority in India appointed by the Crown who would sit above the three presidencies and attempt to bring something resembling coordination to what had been a chaos of competing company ambitions. And it subjected that Governor-General and the company's political and military conduct to a degree of parliamentary scrutiny that had not existed before. The first man to hold that post was Warren Hastings. He was already in Calcutta when the Act passed, already serving as Governor of Bengal, and he was in many ways the ideal and the problem of the company incarnate. He had come to India as a writer, a clerk, the lowest rank in the company's service, at the age of 17, and he had given most of his adult life to learning the subcontinent, its languages, its history, its political structures, its people. He spoke Bengali and Persian and Urdu. He had genuine intellectual curiosity about Indian civilization at a time when most of his colleagues viewed the subcontinent purely as a source of wealth. He commissioned translations of Sanskrit texts into English, the Bhagavad Gita, among others, and believed that understanding Indian law and culture was not merely strategically useful, but genuinely worthwhile. He was not a simple plunderer. He was also a man who presided over extraordinary judicial violence, who used the company's power to prosecute, exile, and execute rivals in ways that troubled even his contemporaries, and who was willing to use whatever instrument lay to hand to keep the company solvent and its territory intact. He was, in other words, a man shaped entirely by the institution he served, capable of greatness and of atrocity, often in the same year, because the institution itself was capable of both and demanded both, and because there was no clean line between them when you were simultaneously the judge, the merchant, the soldier, and the tax collector. He served as Governor-General until 1785, and then he came home to England. What followed was one of the strangest spectacles in the history of British public life. In 1787, Warren Hastings was impeached, formally charged before the House of Lords in a trial that would last, in its episodic, grinding way, until 1795, 8 years. The charges ran to more than 20 articles, encompassing alleged corruption, judicial murder, extortion, and the general crime of ruling 60 million people in ways incompatible with justice and law. And the man who drove the prosecution, who wrote the charges, who gave the opening speech and several of the subsequent speeches, and who poured the best of his formidable rhetorical gifts into the attempt to hold a corporation's conduct to account, was Edmund Burke. Burke was a member of Parliament, a political philosopher, an Irishman who had spent much of his career warning his colleagues about the consequences of power exercised without principle. He had studied the company's Indian conduct with a seriousness that most of his colleagues had not bothered with, and he had concluded that what had happened in Bengal was not simply the inevitable roughness of trade or the understandable excesses of a frontier enterprise, but something that required a name and a reckoning. He called it the plunder of a people. He called it the destruction of an ancient civilization for the benefit of shareholders. He called it a crime, and he put a face on it, the face of Warren Hastings, and he built a trial around that face. The speeches were extraordinary. Burke was one of the finest prose stylists of the 18th century, and he knew it, and the Bengal speeches are among the grandest performances of that tradition. Rolling, oceanic, dense with specific detail and moral passion, built to be delivered aloud in a chamber where the audience had come, in many cases, partly for the theatre of it. He described the famine. He described the judicial practices. He described the systematic draining of a civilization's wealth into the pockets of men who then came home and bought English estates and English votes and English respectability. And he asked Parliament whether it intended to be complicit in this or whether it intended to act. Parliament, in the end, acquitted Hastings on every count. The reasons were multiple, and not all of them dishonest. Some of the charges were genuinely weak. Some of the evidence was contested. The trial had gone on so long that it had become something other than a trial, more a sustained political argument, and the argument had shifted around it. Burke's own politics had grown complicated by 1795. The French Revolution had absorbed his energies and his fears, and the conservative Burke who opposed the terror was a different figure in many people's eyes from the liberal Burke who had prosecuted Hastings. The political coalition that had supported the impeachment had fractured, but there was something deeper than politics in the acquittal. To convict Hastings would have been to convict the company, and to convict the company would have been to convict the system by which Britain had come to hold 60 million people in something that was not quite sovereignty and not quite commerce, the system by which Indian tax revenues funded Indian armies that conquered more Indian territory, that produced more Indian tax revenues, the great self-perpetuating engine of accretion that had been running step by step and ledger entry by ledger entry since the Diwani of 1765. To pull that thread all the way was to unravel something that was now fundamental to how Britain understood itself and its place in the world, and Parliament was not prepared to do that, so it acquitted Hastings and the engine continued. Pitt's India Act of 1784 had already, before the trial concluded, drawn another line of oversight. It created a board of control, a body of government ministers who would supervise the company's political and military affairs, leaving the commercial operations nominally in the hands of the Court of Directors. It was called the dual system, and it was precisely as awkward and contested as that name implies. Two authorities, each with legitimate claims over parts of the same vast enterprise, each jealous of the other's jurisdiction, each capable of passing decisions whose consequences the other would have to live with. It was not a solution, it was a negotiated cohabitation, but it acknowledged formally and in law what the Regulating Act had only partly admitted, that the East India Company was no longer simply a company, and that Parliament could not go on pretending that it was. Now, there is a thread running through all of this. The 1772 crisis, the bailout, the Regulating Act, the oversight, the slow tightening of parliamentary control, that keeps returning to the same question. Where, exactly, was the money? And the answer to that question requires stepping back and looking at what was happening not just in Bengal, but in the wider world of the company's commerce, because there was a problem building quietly in the East that would eventually produce its own extraordinary solution. The problem was tea. Britain had developed over the course of the 18th century what can only be described as a national addiction to Chinese tea. The quantities involved were staggering. By the mid-18th century, millions of pounds of tea were being imported annually, and the consumption continued to grow. Tea was no longer a luxury for the wealthy. It was a staple, drunk by factory workers and field hands and domestic servants, sweetened with sugar from the Caribbean and poured into cups of Indian clay, a whole empire of trade condensed into a single daily ritual. And China, which was where virtually all of this tea came from the great tea gardens of Fujian and Guangdong and Zhejiang, had a particular attitude to the foreign merchants who came to buy it. China wanted silver. That was it, essentially. China was the wealthiest civilization on Earth in terms of what it produced and what it consumed internally, and it had very little interest in what the West had to offer in trade. European woolen cloth was not suited to the Chinese climate or the Chinese market. European manufactures were, for the most part, inferior to Chinese ones. The Chinese emperor and his court regarded foreign trade as a kind of tribute, something to be tolerated at specific ports under specific conditions. Canton was the principal one, and the foreigners who came to trade were expected to understand their position in the hierarchy of things. Britain wanted tea. China wanted silver. And so silver flowed east in enormous quantities year after year, and the trade deficit widened. For the company, which was the entity managing this trade and trying to balance its accounts, the silver outflow was a structural problem. It could not go on indefinitely. Silver was not something you could simply conjure. It had to be mined or earned or taken from somewhere else. And the company, ruling Bengal and collecting its revenues and fighting its wars and paying its dividends, was not in a position to sustain an indefinite hemorrhage of silver to pay for a nation's daily cup. And so someone, and history, does not give us a single inventor, because these solutions tend to emerge from the accumulation of pragmatic decision, rather than from a single moment of deliberate design, hit upon an answer. Or rather, the answer was already present in Bengal, growing in its fields, waiting to be organized. Opium. The opium poppy had been cultivated in India for centuries. It had uses as a medicine, as a painkiller, as a sedative, and it had a long history of recreational use across Asia. But in the 1790s, the company formalized what had previously been scattered and informal. It established a monopoly over the production of opium in Bengal. The poppy fields of Bihar, the rich agricultural land south of the Ganges, where the soil and climate were suited to the crop, were organized into a controlled system. Farmers were contracted to grow the poppies at fixed prices set by the company. The raw opium was collected, processed, pressed into balls, wrapped in poppy petal shells, packed into chests and prepared for sale. The sale, however, required a careful construction of deniability. China had periodically attempted to restrict or ban opium imports, and the company, which held an official trading relationship with the Chinese authorities at Canton, could not be seen to be smuggling narcotics into a country whose laws forbade them, and so the company did not sell the opium to China directly. It auctioned the opium chests in Calcutta to independent merchants, men who operated their own ships and their own trade networks across the Bay of Bengal and the South China Sea, who were known as country traders precisely because they operated outside the company's direct charter. These men bought the opium at auction, sailed it to the Chinese coast, sold it, sometimes openly, sometimes through a network of Chinese middlemen who brought it ashore in the face of official prohibition, and collected silver. They then took that silver to Canton, where the official company supercargoes used it to buy tea. The triangle was complete. Bengal grew the opium. The country traders carried it east. The silver came back. And London got its tea. By the 1830s, opium was the single most valuable commodity trade in the world. The scale of what had been constructed in a few decades, the organization of the Bengali fields, the auction system in Calcutta, the networks of country traders, the financing arrangements, the relationships with Chinese distributors, was extraordinary, and the human cost of it in China was becoming increasingly visible. Opium addiction was spreading through Chinese society in ways that alarmed Chinese officials and eventually the Chinese emperor. The tax revenues of the Qing dynasty were being drained by silver flowing out to pay for a drug that was destroying the health and productivity of a growing portion of the population. Chinese attempts to suppress the trade came to a head in 1839 when the imperial commissioner Lin Zexu, a man of genuine moral seriousness who understood exactly what was happening and was not prepared to pretend otherwise, ordered the confiscation and destruction of over 20,000 chests of opium held by the foreign merchants at Canton. He wrote a letter to Queen Victoria appealing to her conscience. The letter was never answered. What followed instead was the First Opium War, which lasted from 1839 to 1842, and here the story takes a turn that requires a moment of precision. By 1839, the company's own monopoly on the China tea trade had already been abolished by the Charter Act of 1833, which stripped the company of its remaining commercial functions and turned it, formally, into a purely administrative body. The war was not fought by the company. It was fought by the British state, by the Royal Navy and the British Army, on behalf of the commercial system that the company had built. The company had created the opium trade, had organized and profited from it for half a century, and had by the time of the war handed that legacy to its government. The government then went to war to protect it. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842, ended the war on British terms. China paid a large indemnity. 5 ports were opened to British trade, and a small island at the mouth of the Pearl River with an excellent natural harbour was ceded to Britain in perpetuity. Its name was Hong Kong. The Charter Acts of 1813 and 1833 had been doing their own quiet work. The Act of 1813 ended the company's monopoly on Indian trade, opening the subcontinent to any British merchant who wished to trade there. Missionaries arrived in numbers, their passage no longer blockable by company directors who feared religious agitation would disturb the commercial peace. The Act of 1833 went further, stripping the company of the China monopoly and, more fundamentally, of its commercial character. After 1833, the company was not a trading company in any meaningful sense. It was an administrative and military authority, a government, that happened to still have shareholders and still paid dividends, a constitutional anomaly of the most peculiar kind, a private firm that had gone so far beyond its original purpose that its original purpose no longer existed, but whose corporate structure remained, sustained by legal inertia and the interests of the people who owned its stock. Lord Dalhousie became Governor-General in 1848, and under his administration a doctrine was applied with a new vigour and consistency that its name announced plainly enough, the doctrine of lapse. The principle was this: if an Indian ruler died without a natural male heir, the company would annex his territory. It would not recognize adopted heirs, which was a well-established practice in Indian succession custom. It would not negotiate. It would simply absorb. Dalhousie applied this to Satara, to Jhansi, to Nagpur, to Awadh. States of varying size and significance, each annexation adding territory and adding grievance, adding to the sense among the people the company governed that the old accommodations were being abandoned, that the quiet agreements by which diverse populations had coexisted with company authority were being replaced by something colder and more absolute. The annexation of Awadh in 1856 was particularly significant. Awadh, Oud in the English spelling of the time, was a large and wealthy kingdom in the Gangetic Plain, home to a refined culture, to a Nawab whose court was a center of Urdu poetry and classical music, and to a large population of sepoys who served in the company's Bengal army. Many of the sepoys of the Bengal army came from Awadh, and many had family connections to the Nawab's court or to the landowning class whose position was disrupted by annexation. The resentment was personal and specific, not merely general. And then there were the cartridges. The Enfield rifle was a new weapon introduced into the company's Indian army in the 1850s. It was a significant upgrade in firepower, more accurate, longer ranged than the weapons it replaced, but it required a new procedure. The paper cartridge that held the powder charge and the bullet had to be bitten open before loading, and the cartridges were greased to ease their passage down the barrel. The rumor spread, first as whisper, then as certainty, that the grease used was a mixture of cow fat and pig fat. For Hindu sepoys, the cow was sacred. To put its fat in your mouth was a defilement. For Muslim sepoys, the pig was unclean. The same contamination applied, differently but equally. Whether the rumor was entirely accurate in its technical details mattered much less than the fact that it was believable, because it fit a pattern of accumulated grievances, the annexations, the land revenue policies, the missionary presence that some feared signaled an intention to Christianize the army, the erosion of the traditional privileges and status of the sepoy class. At Meerut on the 10th of May 1857, 3 regiments of sepoys refused to accept the cartridges. 85 men were court-martialed, sentenced to hard labor, stripped of their uniforms, and put in chains in front of their fellow soldiers. The following evening, a Sunday evening, when the British officers were largely at church, the sepoys rose. They killed British officers and their families. They released the condemned men, and they marched south through the night to Delhi. At Delhi they found the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, an elderly man of 82 who was a poet of genuine distinction and a man of genuine gentleness, who had lived out his reign in the ceremonial residue of an empire that had been hollowed out over a century. He did not seek to lead a rebellion, but the rebellion sought him, and he accepted it, and in doing so gave it a name and a legitimacy that carried weight across a subcontinent where the memory of Mughal sovereignty had not entirely faded. The rebellion spread across the Gangetic Plain, through Awadh, through the northwestern provinces, through parts of central India. It was not universal. Large parts of the subcontinent did not rise, and the company's Bombay and Madras armies remained largely loyal. The Sikh rulers of the Punjab, who had only recently been defeated by the company in the Anglo-Sikh Wars, and who had their own complex relationship with the company's authority, did not join, and in many places actively assisted in suppression. But in the regions where it did take hold, the rebellion was ferocious on both sides. At Kanpur, Kaunpur in the English spelling, a force of British soldiers and civilians under siege surrendered under terms that promised safe passage. The passage was not honoured, the evacuating party was attacked, and the women and children who survived were held captive and then killed, as British forces approached the city to retake it. The massacre at Kanpur became, in the British telling, the defining atrocity of the rebellion. The image of helpless civilians murdered that justified, in that telling, whatever followed. What followed included the execution of captured rebels by being strapped to the mouths of artillery pieces and blown apart, a form of death that the British had learned with a certain grim efficiency from the Mughal tradition of using cannon against those condemned for the most extreme crimes. It was a performance of power, deliberately theatrical, intended to demonstrate that the price of resistance was not merely death, but a particular kind of death. The rebellion was suppressed by 1858. It took months of bitter fighting, city by city, fort by fort, with the reinforced company armies and the British Army working together against a resistance that was formidable in places, disorganized in others, and ultimately unable to coordinate across the vast distances of the subcontinent. And when it was over, the question that had to be answered was, what comes next? The Government of India, Act of 1858, was the answer. It was a short act, in the way that acts which end eras often are. The big decisions compressed into clear statutory language, the long history folded into a few clauses. The Act transferred all of the company's territories, all of its powers, all of its armies to the British Crown. The company did not govern India anymore. The British government governed India now through a Secretary of State for India in London and through a Viceroy in Calcutta. The Governor-General remained. The title was reframed. The armies were reorganized. The ratio of British to Indian troops increased, and the artillery was placed exclusively under British command because the artillery was what you needed to end a rebellion, and the rebellion had taught a lesson about who should be trusted with it. Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor, was tried, convicted of rebellion, stripped of his remaining titles, and exiled. He was taken to Rangoon in British Burma, where he died in 1862 at the age of 87, composing verses in the Urdu tradition he had practiced all his life. His sons had been killed before his trial, shot in the face by a British officer who displayed their bodies to demonstrate that the Mughal line was finished. He was buried in Rangoon in a grave that was kept unmarked for many decades because even a marker felt like too much acknowledgement of what he represented. He had asked, in one of his last poems, for a burial in the shade of the holy city of his ancestors. He got a cell in the rain. Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India in 1876, 18 years after the act that made it possible, in a ceremony that underscored both the grandeur of what had been accumulated and the distance, in style and self-understanding, from the men who had accumulated it. The merchants of the Court of Proprietors meeting in East India House on Leadenhall Street did not imagine empresses. They imagined dividends. And yet the dividend logic and the empress were the same thing, separated only by time and by the accumulation of each small, reasonable step. The East India Company itself still existed. That is perhaps the strangest part of the afterlife, that the company which had chartered itself to trade pepper and nutmeg, which had pivoted to cotton and then to land revenue, and then to opium, which had fought the Anglo-Mysore Wars, and the Anglo-Maratha Wars, and the Anglo-Sikh Wars, which had produced the Diwani and the Bengal Famine and Plassey and the Regulating Act and Pitt's India Act and the impeachment of Warren Hastings and the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party and the First Opium War and the Treaty of Nanking and the Doctrine of Lapse and the Rebellion of 1857 and the nationalization of 1858, that this company continued to exist in some legal sense for 16 more years. It had no territory, it had no army, it had no trade, it had no employees in any meaningful number, no ships, no factories, no warehouses. It was a corporation emptied entirely of content, a legal shell walking forward on the momentum of its own charter, sustained by the fact that its shareholders still held stock, and that stock still, in some technical sense, represented a claim on something. What it represented practically was a stream of payments. The East India Stock Dividend Redemption Act, passed on the 1st of June 1874, formally dissolved the company and redeemed its stock, paid out the last of what was owed to the last of the shareholders, closed the accounts, ended the legal existence of the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies. 273 years after Elizabeth had been signed the Royal Charter on the last day of 1600, 16 years after it had ceased to govern anything. The directors met for the last time, the stock was redeemed, and the most consequential corporation in the history of the world was formally and quietly dissolved, the way a business partnership ends, with paperwork, with signatures, with the unremarkable administrative finality of a thing that had run its course. Think about what that arc contains and what it says about the nature of power and about the particular kind of power that grows from a balance sheet. The company was not built by conquerors, it was built by merchants, by men who wanted access to pepper and nutmeg and could not get it cheaply enough, who pivoted to cotton when the spice trade closed them out, who found themselves, almost by accident, in possession of a military force and a territorial foothold that they had acquired not because conquest was the goal, but because commerce required protection, and protection required soldiers, and soldiers required territory, and territory required more soldiers, and more territory, and on each step, following from the last, with a kind of grim institutional logic that no individual had designed and no individual could quite stop. The Diwani was not a decision to become a government, it was a decision to secure a revenue stream. The armies were not built to rule a subcontinent, they were built to protect trade routes and to win the local conflicts that threatened the company's commercial position. The opium trade was not designed as a geopolitical instrument, it was designed to solve a balance of payments problem. And every one of these decisions made by men who were working within the constraints of their moment and the pressures of their shareholders and the demands of their balance sheets added together to produce something that none of them had intended and all of them had built. That is the quiet terror of it if you think about it from the inside, from the position of any single person making any single decision within the institution. The merchant in Surat negotiating with a Mughal official for permission to trade was not imagining a private army of 250,000 men. The company servant in Calcutta who recommended collecting the land revenue during the famine, because the revenue target had to be met, because the accounts had to balance, because the shareholders in London expected their dividend, was not imagining 10 million dead, or not imagining it in those terms, or was imagining it and setting the thought aside because the institutional logic demanded the revenue, and the institutional logic was the only frame he had for understanding what he was doing and why. The director in East India House who voted to auction the next season's opium crop was not imagining the first opium war or Hong Kong or a century of Chinese humiliation. He was balancing a ledger. And the sum of all those balanced ledgers was an empire. The Bengal Famine killed an estimated 1/3 of the population of one of the most fertile and densely inhabited regions on Earth, and the revenue was still collected through the dyeing, and the company still needed its bailout 3 years later. The opium trade financed the tea that every labourer and every housewife in Britain drank each morning, and the financing was invisible because the country traders carried it, and the deniability was built in, and by the time the system became visible enough to generate a war, it had been running long enough that the war seemed to those who fought it like a defense of established commerce rather than an aggressive escalation of a harmful trade. The doctrine of lapse annexed states across the Gangetic Plain by denying the legitimacy of adopted heirs, and the doctrine made administrative sense. It simplified the map, it consolidated territory, it reduced the complexity of managing multiple sovereignties. And the sense it made in administrative terms was exactly what made it intolerable in human terms, because The people whose lives were organized around those sovereignties experienced the simplification as dispossession. And then the cartridges, and then Mir route on the 10th of May, and then the last Mughal emperor sitting in Delhi receiving sepoys he had not summoned, and a rebellion he had not planned, and a fate he cannot have entirely failed to foresee, and then the Act of 1858 and the transfer and the Raj. The company did not mean to rule an empire, it meant to make money. Those two things are not as different as they might seem when you follow the logic far enough and long enough, and when the institution is large enough that its money-making requires the capacity for violence, and the capacity for violence requires territory, and the territory requires administration, and the administration requires more soldiers, and the soldiers cost money, and the money requires trade, and the trade requires the violence, and around it goes, each element sustaining the others, the whole thing turning forward on its own internal momentum like a great indifferent wheel. What the wheel ground, it ground completely. What it produced on a scale that no individual decision-maker could see from the inside. That is the mystery of institutions, not of this institution alone, but of all large institutions, that they can produce outcomes that exceed, in scale and in consequence, anything that any of their members intended or perhaps even imagined, that the accumulation of individual decisions made within a shared framework can generate over time something that would have seemed impossible or monstrous, or both, to the men who made the first of those decisions, and that by the time the outcome is visible it is also, in some deep sense, irreversible, too embedded, too large, too entangled with everything around it, to be undone without causing damage that everyone fears more than the damage of continuance. The company borrowed $1.4 million to survive. Britain is still, in some sense, living in the world that loan paid for. There is something almost geological about it if you sit with the whole arc from 1600 to 1874. The way that the company's expansion moved not in sudden dramatic leaps, but in a slow, continuous, almost imperceptible accumulation. A factory here, a fort there, a battle won not by heroism, but by bribery, a legal instrument signed by an emperor who was himself already a pensioner of the force he was legitimizing, a crop organized, a trade route secured, a debt contracted, an act of parliament passed, an empire nationalized, a company dissolved. The way each stage made the next stage not merely possible but in some sense necessary. The way the whole vast structure was less like something that was built than something that grew, not designed but accreted, not planned but accumulated, stone by stone, in the dark, over centuries. The passages are quiet now, the ledgers are closed. East India House on Leadenhall Street no longer stands. It was demolished in 1861, 3 years after the company lost its empire, and 13 years before it lost its legal existence, as if the building sensed what was coming and could not wait. Where it stood, banks and offices and the ordinary commerce of a city that has mostly forgotten what was once managed there, now occupy the ground. The Mughal emperor is buried in Rangoon. Tipu's tiger is in a museum in London. The cartridge is a footnote in the history of military technology. And somewhere in an archive, the Royal Charter that Elizabeth Warren signed on the 31st of December 1600 still exists. The founding document of a company that was given 15 years and a monopoly on the pepper trade, and that lasted 273 years and ended an empire. If this slow telling has carried you through the night, there are more stories here of the same unhurried kind, the same careful descent into old and complicated things, waiting for whenever you want them. And if you feel moved, somewhere in the quiet, to share where in the world you are listening from tonight, I would genuinely like to know. The comments are there, and I read them. You have followed this far enough. Let the rest of it go. That's enough explaining for one night. Rest now.